Hi, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Drexel University Sport Coaching Leadership webinar. My name's Cameron Casoglis, who, for those of you that I don't know, and really excited to welcome Jeremy Piasecki and his team to tonight's presentation on a bad playing field of recognizing and remedying toxic cultures. So before we get underway, I just wanted to share a couple of things for those of you that aren't aware. We have a number of webinars. Actually, we've had 42 webinars in the last 12 months that are free access that you can jump on through the Drexel University website. And we've got everything from issues relating to nutrition, the foundations of coaching, some lessons from legends, and some more pressing topics like dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion in the sport environment. So thrilled that so many of you could join us for tonight's webinar. And coming up, we've got an athlete leadership development workshop coming up in the summer that we're happy to share information as we secure that date. One thing that I'd love for you to throw in the chat as we're getting started here is, what's one thing that you hope to take away from tonight's presentation? If you could just drop that in the chat. Love to just share that with our presenters so that they have a bit of a sense of what it is that you're hoping that they will cover. I know there's a lot of information that we're going to get through, so I'm eager to hand it over. But if you just want to drop that in the chat, what's one thing you hope that you'll take away from this presentation on toxic cultures? And Jeremy and I have been in conversation for quite some time now about what would be a compelling topic for this audience, and again, really thrilled that we've got a great turnout for tonight's presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the impact of toxic cultures, talk about the short and the long-term effects and issues that relate to athlete performance, and then look at opportunities to overcome this challenge. So, Jeremy, I'm going to hand it over to you. We'll do the presentation to start off with, but if you drop questions in, we'll come to those at the end. All right. So, Jeremy, welcome, and thrilled that you can be with us.
Thank you very much, Cam. I appreciate it. Hold on, I'm trying to figure out how to switch it to my screen here. Hold on.
You should be able to do that right now. And so while Jeremy's doing that, if you could drop in, a couple of great things already. Overcome ego and increase buy-in from Aaron. Thank you for that. And keeping a toxic culture from developing. I like it. That's Sam, the man. Establishing the right culture immediately in youth sport environment. I'm pretty confident that we're going to be covering that and a lot more. So, Jeremy, your slides are up. So over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Cam. I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you very much for attending our webinar today. I really do appreciate it. Today's webinar is about a bad playing field. We will be discussing and recognizing and remedying toxic environments and cultures in sport, and understanding some of the perceptions of administrators, coaches, and athletes. Today's topics are the impact of a toxic culture, the short and long-term mental, physical, and emotional impacts on athletes, exploring opportunities to address a toxic culture. And there will be three of us speaking to you today. Myself, I'm a culture and sports researcher and a longtime coach. Ali Williams is going to be speaking about her athlete experience, and Robert Boland will be speaking about sports organizations. A little bit about me. I'm currently finishing my doctoral research on the lived experience of personnel adversely impacted by toxic leadership in organizations. I've competed and coached at almost all levels, to include national and international levels, and many also know that I introduced the sport of water polo to Afghanistan many years ago. I use my education and experience to help teams, coaches, athletes, support staff, and organizations to better understand culture and leadership, how to positively influence change, and to strive for peak performance in a positive environment. Ali, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. My name is Allie Williams, and my former life, I was a professional synchronized swimmer, which has been recently rebranded to artistic swimming. So it is an Olympic sport. Some of you may know of it and some of you may not, but it's a very small Olympic sport. And I started out on the national team in my teenage years. I ended up competing for Team USA in 3 world championships. I was a medalist in 2 Pan American Games, and I was alternate for the 2016 Olympic duet. So safe to say it was a fairly immersive life experience for me. Then I was a head coach for a few years. I received a bachelor's degree from UCLA, and I did do an undergraduate thesis studying the rates of depression and emotional abuse in our lead artistic swimmers on Team USA, because I really wanted to understand my own experience more deeply. And then that research actually ended up being cited recently in a New York Times article dealing cultural issues in my sport. So that was a big achievement. And then now I'm working on my master's degree in transformational coaching and leadership at UCLA. I'm passionate about improving the culture of sport. And I have my own business now helping people connect and find peace with the water, both people who are artistic swimmers and who are not artistic swimmers. So thanks again for having me. Look forward to speaking with all of you.
Hi, I'm Bob Boland. I had until I met Jeremy the most unusual job in the world as athletic integrity officer at Penn State. I think being coach of the Afghan national water polo team might be a more unusual position, but at least everyone knows what sport he's playing. I'm here to talk about the university perspective or institutional perspective. And my job is an investigatory, but also a policy development one that helps make sure that the athletic program at Penn State is meeting its commitment to its community, to the university's highest values, and to the board of trustees and the president. And sometimes that is a challenge when you think about athletics at the highest levels in the United States can be big business. And that is my job. I came to this as a former college athlete. I competed in the wrestling Olympic trials along the way, but bowed out at the very early stages in my career. I also played football at Columbia and wrestled there as well, and worked in athletics at the Southeastern Conference, the University of Tennessee, and was an agent representing athletes and coaches for a number of years. I think my perspective will be institutional, but to some degree, one of the values I bring is I believe very strongly in the power of the coach-mentor-athlete relationship being one of the most powerful in all of education, and that's something I'm committed to making sure we preserve.
So we're going to now move into talking about what exactly a toxic culture is. And theorists, even today in 2021, still have not agreed on what a definition of toxic culture is. However, toxic leader was first identified in literature back in 1996. Even though it was talked about a lot before then, it didn't start making it into literature until the mid-90s. However, many of the common themes in literature are things like harmful leadership, abuse, bullying, manipulation, high degrees of incompetence, hostility, exploitation, indifference, and negativity. And I also want to talk real quick that that mismanagement and toxic culture are not the same thing. Mismanagement is mostly about mismanaging a process or a program, those types of things. Toxic culture is a completely different thing. And so I just want to make sure that everyone does understand that we're not talking about just poor managers who or bad coaches who are just mismanaging. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about toxic cultures. So I want to talk about a toxic organization being successful. And ultimately, a toxic organization can be successful in the short term. And normally, there's a desire to win at all costs, regardless of what the damage is. And the damage could be on an athlete, a team, an organization as a whole. There's usually a culture of fear associated with a toxic culture. And that's what gets the people to perform, and they perform out of survival, not out of the willingness to to complete the mission or perform as a team or any of those things. And ultimately, athletes and coaches and support staff are performing so they are not the toxic leader's next target or the toxic organization's next target. And those are important things to remember. And ultimately, operating in a toxic culture results in the organization being at severe risk of failure or destruction. And I wanted to go over some statistics with you before we start speaking about the lived experience. In my doctoral research, I've surveyed over 1,100 people if they ever had a toxic leader or part of a toxic organization. And an overwhelming answer was provided. Over 99% of those that I surveyed said yes. Another very important statistic here is that over 25% more women stated that they experienced a toxic culture. And what was the most unfortunate was that women reported that in addition to the same issues that men were experiencing and that they were responding in their surveys, women were definitely more prone to sexual harassment and assault. And they reported that more frequently in the survey, and that women were also clearly treated differently because of their gender. Not necessarily sexism, which that was obviously prevalent, but more that women were assumed to be less capable or weak or had less endurance or were not equipped to handle rapidly developing situations like game day situations. And those were very sad to see a lot of those answers in the surveys. When we're talking about age of people that were reporting toxic leadership or toxic cultures, one of the most interesting things was that 60% of those who experienced a toxic culture or toxic organizations were the same age as those who are collegiate, pro, and Olympic age athletes. And so, as we move along through this webinar, it's important to realize and understand that most of the people are in this age group of athletes. And so how are we adversely impacting athletes mentally, physically, and emotionally, through toxic cultures or toxic leaders or toxic organizations? Those are important things to think about, is that you're just not talking about that an organization is dysfunctional. It's the impact, the lifelong impact sometimes of those who are unfortunately being targeted or just participating in a toxic culture. So now we're going to move on to the lived experience of an athlete, a coach, and an organization. And I'm going to go ahead and have Ali take over here.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing the topic. So I thought it might be helpful to go through a progression. I was in competitive sports for 20 years, but it seemed like too much to try to address all of it. So I thought I selected kind of my formative years of getting into the sport and my teenage years to just help explain like how things started and how they developed and where they ended up. So, I joined sports for the same reason I think a lot of people do, which was because it was creative and fun. When I first started it, the activity didn't even have a name. It was just me playing in my backyard pool. And it was the only place in the world that I felt really free. And I was really delighted to discover that my three favorite things, water, music, and movement, had like this organized activity associated with them, called synchronized swimming. And my sister discovered the organized sport. And of course, I wanted to do anything she was doing. And she even came to this webinar to support me. So thank you, Valerie. But being a beginner at something is like the best part, because there's no expectations and all steps of progress are celebrated. And there's no destination in mind. So I started to excel at the sport. And so then I had started seeking new environments, including better clubs and coaches. I didn't realize that I was winning or that I was talented. I was just having fun. But at my core, I had a desire for excellence, a desire that I think pervades all aspects of my life. So without really knowing what I was doing, I pushed forwards towards these better clubs and better coaching. And I would master one environment and be hungry for the next. And there were people around me doing what I was doing, so it didn't seem strange. It felt normal. And at age 13, I joined a team that was 90 miles away from my home, which in 10th grade, I saw no problem with taking honors classes and being on the road for 5 hours to train, and do 8-hour weekends. And, it paid off in a competitive aspect. I won my first national championship that year, but I don't remember being encouraged or celebrated for that accomplishment, like by my club or by my family. And I'm not sure exactly why that was, but I think it was kind of like one of the first red flags that things were starting to kind of go south. Dysfunction kind of started flourishing around me, and there was this loss of innocence. It kind of started to slowly erode, like eating disorders started to form and unfold around me. Became sensitive to eat in front of each other, which was a real problem when you're training your body for 8 hours at a time together. And, it's difficult to reflect on the culture because at the time it was so normalized. In hindsight, the strictness and rigidity with which we were all held was both challenging and damaging. And I think there's a strange paradox of thriving in something and being damaged by it. For example, you couldn't miss practice for any reason. There was no life outside synchronized swimming. Like your family and friends weren't important. And it's only in hindsight that I realized like what this creates for athletes. You simply don't develop any sense of self. And this was exacerbated by being forbidden from speaking. So you weren't allowed to do anything except listen to the coaches, and you would get in big trouble if you weren't looking directly at them while they were talking. And we said it was about excellence, but it really felt like it was more about dominance and control. So on top of this, the physical standards were unbearable for many. So not only did you have to be like rail thin, you had to be flexible and tall with pliable knees, feet, and ankles. And I had most of these qualities naturally. So I think I kind of like got by more easily than some of my teammates who didn't have those qualities naturally. And I think that's probably why I lasted a long time in the sport when I had teammates just kind of dropping off. Stretching until tears was like a common regular practice. You would get pushed down in your splits with no concern for the effect on your body. We even learned to do it to each other. One coach would stretch my feet, which apparently were ugly and bad, until I cried. And I remember before my first finals at junior nationals, which was a remarkable achievement for a 14-year-old, my coach stretched my feet until I was crying just moments before my performance. And we had a really unsynchronized performance, which I blamed myself for many years. And it didn't really feel like that coach was trying to help me. I felt like she was mad at me, and that was her way of making me pay for my insubordination. So I wonder now, like, how that swim could have gone if I hadn't been pushed to tears minutes beforehand. And I finally realized like it wasn't necessarily my fault it didn't go well. So after a few more years of this, I made my first junior national team. And at junior nationals that year, we successfully defended the team's title, and my trio placed third in the nation, which once again should have been a time for celebration. But I distinctly remember just like feeling dead inside when I was named to the team. And my coach was so mad at me all the time. I like really don't even know for what. I guess just having independent thoughts, which ran counter to the culture she was trying to create. I constantly got in trouble for talking back, which I just thought like I was sharing ideas. But I was really expected to behave like a robot. And this is when some self-destructive behaviors started. This was the year I started drinking. I was 16. I should have mentioned additionally, my parents had separated, and some of us had moved into a small apartment in a bad area. I was taking the train to practice for a while. I would leave at 5:30 in the morning and take the train to arrive at 8 a.m. and like bike to the pool. I would get there at 8:15 and still be in trouble for being late. So you just couldn't really do anything right. And, I'd cry before even working with my coach because I just felt like she hated me and I couldn't do anything right. I started cutting myself at that time, and nobody ever said anything. That coach in particular would accuse me of purposely ignoring her feedback and just doing things the way I wanted, which I think is kind of a bizarre thing to accuse a teenager of. And, she was the coach of the junior national team that year. And me and my teammates were half of the squad. So it was the same culture, just isolated together. And now we were training 8 hours a day. I got in trouble for drinking along with a few other teammates. And our formal punishment was light because we couldn't afford to lose 4 team members at once. And I remember wanting to leave the team because I was just so unhappy and I'd gotten in trouble for drinking and I was misbehaving and acting out. And I remember my coach telling me that I had to stay and finish the season. And I don't remember her asking me once if I was okay or why I was misbehaving. Like, why was this straight A student, it's like really skilled and really talented at this sport, acting out? And none of the adults around me ever like even bothered to just ask, like, hey, Allison, are you okay? So, this cycle perpetuated throughout the next 10 years on the national team. And again, I chose to highlight these years as part of my lived experience because they really set the tone for the rest of my time to come. Even though the cast of characters rotated, the culture was the same for the next 10 years after that. There was always this immense pressure to lose weight in short periods of time, guilt if you were too short or the wrong skin color, and there's this kind of survival of the fittest mentality. So basically, the athletes who ended up on the team and competing at the meet were usually the only ones left standing. If you had an injury or an illness, it was best not to say anything and just push through it, which made you a warrior worthy of respect. And showing any sign of weakness was not an option, which left us isolated from each other. So things were so bad, there wasn't really anything to talk about. Burdening another athletes with your problems didn't seem helpful. So we all just struggled alone. And I didn't really have a home to go back to because my parents had gotten divorced and this was my home, as dysfunctional as it was. And I didn't have any frame of reference to things to leave. There's only one country I'm a citizen of, only one sport I know, and only one national team. And I kept thinking that things might improve at various points along the way, but they never really did. And so some of the ways that has affected my life today are some of the things I'm still working on are learning how to form non-abusive relationships. So I learned total obedience to commands. And for example, some of my intimate relationships with boyfriends wasn't necessarily that my boyfriends were super abusive. It was that I only knew how to be obedient and I only knew how to accept commands. And so I only kind of knew how to be abused. So I would continue recreating that dynamic in my own life until I finally realized I was doing that and figured out how to break out of it. And another thing I'm trying to learn is how to be interdependent instead of independent. So I was taught this kind of radical independence, like never rely on anyone, never ask for help. And I'm still trying to learn how to be in community. I'm still learning how to feel comfortable and safe in my body, like learning how to actually recultivate a connection with my body instead of being numb to it, learn how to listen to my body instead of override what it's telling me. I'm still learning how to not hide in the corners and feel like it's okay to exist and take up space. Yesterday, even I had a huge trigger with someone I live with in community. I felt like she was ignoring me and that I didn't have value. And, I realized that she was representing a coach that I had on the national team from a while ago who really, really seriously pretended like I didn't exist in a way that I'd never experienced. And, so I finally realized that that's what she was representing. And I was realizing I was having a trauma response, and I was able to kind of pull out of that cycle and have a positive interaction with her. So, the inner work can change things and is continuing to change things for me over time. And, there is rehabilitation for all of us. So there isn't really a happy ending to the competitive part of the story because my experience was the same every year, pretty much different variations on the same thing. But there is a happy ending otherwise. I've reclaimed my own joy for the sport. I work in a new way. I'm hosting my first big professional event in Hawaii this summer. I'm bringing 50 people here to cultivate connection and peace with the water and trying to create space to allow others to facilitate their own healing process, like being held in the womb of Mother Earth. So there is a eventually happy ending to the story. And thank you all for listening to my experience.
Thank you for sharing that, Allie. I know that was difficult, but we do appreciate it. Okay, we're going to go on and move on to the coach's experience. And I've encountered this situation many times in my career as a coach. And in each time, the organization was looking for a solution to a problem that on the surface was really poor performance, where the team didn't make the expectations of where those in the front office thought the team should should be competing at, or athletes should be competing at a certain level. And normally when I would interview or talk to an organization about a position that they were advertising, that would be the first thing, was that always they were trying to continuously build on their program. But normally it was once that I was in the role that I identified that the real culprit was the toxic culture. And some of the things that I saw was basically there's no direction of the organization other than to focus on the star athletes. All the other athletes were not important at all whatsoever. They were almost like a distraction or a nuisance. And in individual sports, obviously to put fans in the seats, or to get funding for your organization, you may want to focus on the star athletes because they're your money makers. And I understand that. However, even in team sports, a lot of these athletes who were not the star athletes, they were just ignored or treated poorly, or really cast aside. And it's difficult to have a team, even with just one or two star athletes. There has to be a supporting cast, and not only for competition, but in practice as well. There has to be those people, whether it's an individual or a team sport. One of the other things that I noticed was that there's a lot of manipulation from the senior members of the organization. They're really trying to carry out their own personal plans and missions and milestones that were not necessarily in line with what the organization was trying to accomplish. There was zero trust at the beginning of me as the new coach coming in, or any new coaching staff or support staff. And if the abusive personnel were still involved, that trust never evolved at all until those destructive forces were removed. And each person, whether it was an athlete, assistant coach, or support staff, were always not remotely performing at a high level. And so when I would come to the organization like that, it would be more about influencing change than actually coaching athletes or a team. And those were some of the biggest concerns and issues that I had coming into all those situations, was that they really did not need a coach. They really needed someone to help influence change. And some of those times I was not the right person to do that because the organization was not ready for that change. And so, there were times where it was just not a good opportunity for anyone involved, and I would have to move on from that opportunity. As much as I cared about the athletes and the team, there was just nothing that I would be able to do to fix a extremely toxic culture like that, unless the organization itself was willing to change. And there was a time where the president of the board saw this and did step aside along with the president, but most of the other times that never came to fruition. Bob, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you as the organization.
Yeah, and this is a unique and difficult perspective in thinking of the organizational perspective. And as Jeremy pointed out, and I should probably comment that it's Jeremy's doctoral work that drew me here. I've worked and taught in sports management and sports law for a number of years. I've consulted in professional sports, and a lot of time it's the organizational's failure. Now, I said I have one of the more unusual jobs. I try to make sure that my institution's athletic program, which is a business, also has the best interests of its student athletes and the athletic culture and the values of the athletic culture at heart. And sometimes that's a challenging process. It isn't always easy. There are things that are businesses, but I think it's important to look at there are common roots in organizational challenges around toxic cultures in sports. And I think the first one is when individual behavior goes unrecognized and uncorrected. And that can come from any standpoint. It can come from the athlete, can come from the organizational perspective, could come from the sports perspective. I think in the coaching world, one of the most important things, and I've seen it in pro sports, maybe even in the most extreme example, when you rise to be a head coach, you actually, and I've represented some head coaches too, you actually think you know everything that you're supposed to know, or at least believe you have to know everything. And I think one of the biggest challenges is coaches are not as well supervised as many other professions. They're not alone in this. Lawyers are left alone a lot. Doctors can be left alone a lot. We see challenges, but some of our worst stories come out of the fact that bad issues, bad manifestations, or even indifferent manifestations are allowed to metastasize. Harmful behavior in one example moves into that, and that's a key thought. Allie mentioned this, and I think in exactly the same terms I did, and we didn't compare our notes as we moved to this, but the power control and even submission dynamics that exist in sports are unique. They're unique for two reasons. First, the nature of athletics supports a power dynamic, the idea that the coach is the leader, they're the field general, they're in charge. We don't see that in most of our other institutions. They're not as authoritarian. They don't exist in that same level of power. And we see some challenges sometimes when it's easy to suppress a negative outcome or a negative feeling because of that power dynamic. We also have a special allure in athletic success and participation. As I said before, I think that one of the most dynamic and most special of all educational relationships is the coach to athlete, but it also is one of the hardest to achieve and get right. And the allure of athletic success makes us want to have it be right, that we'll change ourselves in negative ways to make it right at times. And I think that's an important one to think about as well. Are we watching the power control and submission dynamics that exist in sports? And I would posit that a wise coach knows exactly how much influence they have and use the power and control and submission dynamics very, very carefully. One of the most dynamic coaches I've ever been around was Pat Summitt, and all her players called her Pat. There wasn't a whole lot of doubt as who was in charge. And sometimes she might have actually used that power and control and that coach's voice and that stare a little powerfully. But I think if you talk to her players, there were honest assessments of herself, and her criticism and her coaching favor was spread evenly and fairly. So I think there are you got to be very careful of that, and particularly today because it is anachronistic. I think you also have to have a culture where complaints aren't dismissed, and that rather they're reviewed in earnest. I want to make sure that you don't get number 3, that complaints are dismissed rather than reviewed in earnest is a good point. That's actually the challenge. They are too often dismissed. That we don't see that behavior, or he would never do that, or she could never. We don't see that. And I think that's important to think about, that we have structures where we can review organizations neutrally, fairly, and reliably. And that examination and reporting don't equal guilt, so that the coach doesn't feel the need to suppress, or the leader of the organization doesn't feel the need to suppress negative information, but they investigate it with a certain equanimity. I'd be shocking that if you look at it in this context, that I do yoga, but I do yoga, and I think equanimity is an important concept, that we're balanced in this thought, so that the idea that we examine issues that are even-handedly and consistently. There's also another challenge of sport that's unique. The fear of retaliation is enormously high in sport, and particularly in toxic cultures. And I think that's important that we're aware of that and we recognize retaliation. Almost every dynamic plan that puts back or tries to restore justice always has a non-retaliation element to that restorative point. And I think it's critically important that we recognize that retaliation is high, and we may not get honest responses from the first time. We need to look carefully to make sure that we're looking at it. And finally, important to look at that winning is a masking agent. As Jeremy pointed out earlier, that success creates perceptions of righteousness or wholeness. Now, I think if you looked at and surveyed and pulled apart really high-performing organizations, they generally are high intellectually, they generally have high emotional intelligence, and they generally are pretty fair. So I think if you were to think about, as an indicator, they're pretty good for the most part, but there's not a one-to-one correlation. Maybe you'd find a 67% correlation between winning and successful cultures. And sometimes winning can mask really ominous cultures, as Jeremy points out. And sometimes winning can create its own pressure to cut corners, to be ethically challenged, to try to perpetuate success at the expense of our values. And ultimately the pressure of the next game, the next competition, creates its own pressure and creates its own blindness or myopia. So the idea that organizational success or the need for success causes myopia and corner cutting, yeah, that's a reality. And I think it's very important. And the last thing I'd add is that this isn't a perfect list. It's a list that fits on a slide for the time we had today from an organizational perspective, or from an organizational perspective trying to remedy these challenges. But I think it's important to go back to the original step, to have strong supervisory and mentor relationships, to have a really good structure where coaches recognize with humility and empathy the dynamics of power that are innate to their sport. That's the modern coach. They get that complaints are dealt with then and reviewed in earnest, no matter what they are, no matter how credible or incredible they seem, that they'll be looked into. And I think we also have to recognize, and this is the challenge of somebody who does investigations for a living, that not every investigation is perfect either. Sometimes allegations can't be corroborated, and it's important to have a culture of openness where people are free to come forward so corroboration can take place. And then finally, I think the last one is, again, we shouldn't mistake winning or pressure for allowing us to cut corners on our values. Everyone who's ever played a sport has the lived experience of running through the line, swimming to the wall, running to touch that wall and coming back. And that's the only way we get better. I think, unfortunately, because we introduce pressure and other externalities, we give up those values. And I think that's an important one to think about. So those would be my thoughts on the organizational perspective. And they do sort of work to deal with this, but no organization is perfect. And I think we all have to approach it with humility as we move forward.
Thank you for sharing that, Bob. I appreciate it. So I would like everyone to think about these words from people like athletes, coaches, and members of organizations. Words like frozen, paralyzed, please, emotional, fled, and overwhelmed. These were just some of the common words of those surveyed, of those 1,120 some odd people that I surveyed. Those were some of the many common themes that came out. And things to remember is that toxic individuals and organizations have little regard about the harm that they inflict on people. They have no guilt, regret, or remorse. And so if over 1,100 people that I surveyed, the most common words are pleas for help or that they were paralyzed, those are some very powerful words and things to think about when you're looking at your own organization, whether it's a sports organization or the private sector or in government service, or in a national governing body for sports. Those are things to think about, that your athletes and coaches and support staff, most people are willing to tell you how they feel. But in a toxic organization or with toxic leaders, that's extremely difficult. And every time through my doctoral research, I would read a survey response, or I would read a written statement from a participant, or I would read the transcript from when I interviewed a participant in my research study. And it would just be so sad, because if people would have sat down and actually listened to what these athletes or coaches or support staff were saying, I think so much could have changed once the toxic organizations saw how they were personally impacting someone. And if you reflect back when you were a kid and you would see another child was hurt or in distress, most people would go to that child and say, is everything okay? How can I help? And for some reason, as we get older, or as we're in important, athletes are competing for important teams, I think a lot of that is forgotten about. And ultimately, it comes down to needing to focus on the athletes and the team in general. And in each situation, I'm going to let Ali, and then I'm going to speak a little bit, and then Bob, just talk about in each scenario, in each lived experience, in each organization and role, what could have been done differently. So Ali, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jeremy. So one of the first things is that, I think elite sports especially is so immersive. A lot of athletes might be spending more time with their sports team when they're with their own family. So we have to take care of each other, and wellness has to come first. And like Jeremy said, that should could be really simple things like asking, "Are you okay? How can I help?" Noticing people who are in distress and doing something about it instead of just letting the moment go by and I guess assuming everything's okay. I think this conversation is already raising awareness. So this is really helpful. Thank you all for being here and just for listening. I think the organization, there has to be an awareness and acknowledgement of what's happened in the past. Like United States Artistic Swimming has kind of up till now seemingly refused to issue any kind of apology about the negative culture that's gone on for decades in the sport. I think it's just because they're so scared of getting sued. They don't want to take any responsibility because then that might open them up to litigation. But until they're willing to do that, I don't know how much progress there can really be. And then we needed an intention set for collective healing. Healing is not a word that's often used in sports. I think the collective does need healing, and the more people are holding space for that, the more easily it can occur. There should be emotional intelligence training for all parties. Like a lot of coaches are just reiterating how they were coached. So just kind of realizing, oh, like I was trained this way, but that doesn't mean it's the best way. Or realizing to oneself, oh, I was trained a certain way and it actually was really abusive and bad. Maybe I could try something different. There's just that reflective process that comes through developing emotional intelligence. We also need to codify what physical and emotional abuse are relative to specific sports. So for example, we're throwing around this term emotional abuse, but nobody really knows what it means. And the actual Safe Sport Code, which is governing Olympic sport in particular, which was a response to the Larry Nassar abuse scandal. The problem is like there's a clause in it that says, okay, here's what physical and emotional misconduct are, but if it's something that's regularly practiced in your sport, it's okay. So it's kind of a loop where any coach could say, well, this is yelling at my athletes is something that's regularly done in my sport. It's not abusive. So until we actually codify what is acceptable and not acceptable, I don't know how much progress we can make on reducing like abusive behaviors. And also, I did want to add one thing, that parents should be asking more questions about how things are going. Like I think my parents really didn't know how bad things were because they wanted to let the coach do their thing. And I thought it was normal. So there was that kind of disconnect in communication about what was really going on.
Thank you, Ali, for sharing that. So as a coach, the focus really needs to be on the athletes and the team as a whole. And and the focus on team is not only athletes, it's also support staff, assistant coaches, front office staff, anyone who's involved in the organization. Those people need to be focused on. And it's not only a focus on let's worry about them or let's focus on their performance in a competition, but it's also their physical, mental, and emotional health. Those are extremely important. Is when someone is going home every day, when an athlete's going home every day, are they going in the fetal position in a dark corner in their room? Are they having healthy connections with friends and family? Or are they hiding because they don't know how to process all the toxicity that's around them? And so you'll see, organizations that have, positive organizational cultures, their athletes and teams are happy and healthy, mentally, physically, and emotionally for the most part, both not only short term, but long term as well. And we heard what Ali talked about, even today, years after she's done her time with the national team and on Team USA, she's still having problems forming, quality relationships. And for a lot of people who haven't experienced it, it's hard to understand or realize that it's not only the short-term impact where, yeah, an athlete might cry, or, oh, an athlete will feel bad, or an assistant coach will feel that they're not performing at the level they should be because they got yelled at by the head coach or someone in the front office. But there's legitimate long-term mental, physical, and emotional impacts that can last a lifetime. So that's where the focus needs to be. There needs to be trust in an environment where people can truly open up without fear of repercussions, fear of retaliation, fear of retribution. If an athlete cries out or an assistant coach spots something that's unsafe, whether it's like a safety issue or that someone is being put in an unsafe environment, those things need to be taken seriously, and there can't be retaliation or retribution. Coaches and front office staff must address issues, whether they're perceived as legitimate or not. If someone is coming out with, an issue that they want addressed, or something that they see that is not safe, or something that someone's saying which is hurtful to others, it really needs to be addressed. It needs to be investigated, and if they can't remove their own bias, which most people cannot, then they really should bring in a third party just to take a look at it, because what the organization may be seeing is not the same as what the athletes are seeing. And just because only one athlete is addressing it does not mean that there's not more than one athlete who's suffering whatever that issue may be. And again, I'm going to close out what could be done differently is people must be the focus. You have to think of it as they're people of your own family. Would you treat your own children that way? Would you treat your own spouse that way? What would happen if your child or your spouse was being treated that way? Would you be okay with it? And those are things to think about when people are truly the focus, or should be the focus in the end. And Bob, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Get to say that I'm on mute. The mute button has undone me again. Anyway, I think what I say dovetails it. Although as a lawyer and a professor, I've written longer bullet points. So why use one word when two longer ones will do? But essentially, I believe that people don't want to fail, but we often flail into flailing or toxic experiences. I think if you're starting to look at losing records or coaches trying to coach on and continue their contract and their livelihood, they're particularly at risk. The way you manage that, though, I think as you get to it, is that you have good managerial and supervisory oversight, and that there's a lot of correction of the pitfalls. I think every coach needs a mentor. Every coach needs somebody who can help guide them through this. In that way, coaching is less a lonely practice, and coaches are less likely to fall into toxic traps along the way. There are some people who obviously will always bring a toxic ego to sports, and sport actually does attract those people too. The way to manage that is to foster an ethical and growth-oriented culture where people can speak up and aren't afraid of retaliation. That may involve third parties, as Jeremy pointed out. The idea of third parties that go to it just works as you move it. And then I think it's important to have a strong commitment to training and best practices, both in ethics and policy. I'm going to conclude it with a little bit of a story before I go, and then have a strong ability to review your employees along the way. But I had a coach who I've become particularly close to on a variety of levels. And someone asked me when I recommended this coach for a new position, and I was a reference, how did you get to know this coach? Well, I basically reviewed this coach for 3 years. And what I found is that this coach was able to take everything that I was giving to them, be able to institute best practices, became growth oriented, dealt with the being under review as an opportunity for improvement, and treated me not as an investigator or somebody who could do them harm, but somebody who could give them clues to help build positive culture. And I think it's the peak of my relationship in my current role is that I can be somebody who helps move coaches, who provides feedback to help move coaches out of difficult, toxic, falling positions, because good people don't want to be there. But also, I can help them become an instrument of improvement. And I think that's one of the challenges I wish every program had, is a fair amount of feedback that isn't just on the competitive platform, but is to the competitive and personal and lived experience platform. So I'm proud to work with you, Jeremy, in this group and talk to you today about these issues.
Thank you, Bob. We're going to go ahead and open this up for a question and answer session. I'm sure Cam has been consolidating any questions that were brought up now during the chat or before the when people registered.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and Ali, Bob. Really great presentation, and certainly appreciate what you each shared here. I think the openness and real care that you've given to the comments you shared has really been very insightful. Want to touch on something, Bob, you'd mentioned in terms of the isolated nature of coaching and the supervision that seems lacking. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on a lot of what we talk about here is about preparation of coaches. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what could we be doing? You mentioned mentoring, you mentioned, the nature of the feedback that you're giving from an administrator's perspective. But what are the other tools and skills can we be preparing coaches to really be able to address the loneliness in some respects of being a coach? And there aren't a lot of avenues to be able to connect with others to figure out, okay, am I off track? And if so,
and okay, I was waiting for that answer to come. I think it's a challenge. I think it is a challenge to create that. I think it's important for every coach to create that from someone who gives difficult advice and is up on best practices. So programs like this might be one of those places to begin to identify that. I wish all the work I did was public. Penn State sort of sits between the public and private institution. So I would love that my reports were all public and that people could take that. I wish Safe Sport operated in greater transparency in their situations. So you could see all the things that they're doing to some degree. So I wish we operated in a little greater public space and a little greater clarity sometimes. But I do think that courses in this, finding out that you're not alone and finding a mentor who's willing to give you honest feedback is the most important. I also think there are steps you could do when you think about it is we review every class with a class evaluation. We professors pore over them and try to fix them every year. We always hit the golf shot the opposite way. Yep. Why aren't sports teams doing their same level of assessment? Why aren't there assessment providers to give that experience provider? So there probably should be that at your club or at your college or even at the professional level. We get rumors out really fast and they're hard to fix for years and years and years. So sometimes it takes big change. So I think it's important to establish a level of assessment. And I think somebody said in the notes, a very flat culture where people can speak up and don't feel that they're going to be retaliated against. Sure.
And I think Ali, you touched on it as well, particularly from the Safe Sport perspective, but love to hear your comments, particularly, if you were to give your younger self some advice, what was sort of that turning point where you were able to sort of see the tide change and you were able to start to see that there was another perspective and you were able to start I'll call it the healing. I know you didn't use that word, but would there be some advice you would have given yourself, or was there a particular event where you thought, oh, okay, I can now start to move on from what you've shared as a unbelievably grueling environment that you went through? So I'd love to hear some more about that, Ali.
Well, I do think for me, it took being removed from the situation to realize how wrong it was. It's almost like the frog that's in water that's slowly boiling and doesn't realize it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. If I jumped into boiling water, I think I would have known to jump back out, but it did take being away from it to get some perspective. I do think like reconnecting to my intuition about right and wrong was really helpful. And that's something we should be all we're all capable of encouraging each other to do. Like, no matter what context I'm working in sports, whether I'm an athlete or a coach or working with you as my coworker, I could be asking you, like, you ask me a difficult, let's say we're coworkers, and you say, hey, Allie, there's this difficult situation. I don't know how to handle X, Y, and Z. I could say, well, check in with your gut. What is your intuition telling you? What really feels like right and wrong? What are some of the pros and cons? Like, we just, somehow sports has just gotten so disconnected from a basic sense of human decency that I think if we just all thought like, okay, how do we treat each other like humans? The situation would kind of start to resolve itself, because the things that we're getting away with in sports culture are not acceptable in classrooms. Like, no teacher would ever get away with yelling at their students. So we just need to like go back to the beginning and remember how to treat each other with like the basic decency and respect due all human beings.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Great, Ali. Thank you very much. And Joe, I know we're getting pretty close to the top of the hour, but wanted just to give you the final word here, particularly as it as it relates to sort of the top down, bottom up culture. Sometimes we and much of what we said here is, if there's the oversight from upper level management, from key stakeholders, that's certainly a significant part of the solution. But in your perspective, I think also shares that toxicity can actually be bottom up. And so final word, just in terms of a key takeaway, and love to see if anyone has a takeaway that they'd love to drop in the chat as Jeremy's closing out here.
Yeah, so organizational cultures or team cultures are a top-down concept, which are from the leaders of the organizations. They are going to set the tone. They are going to dictate what that organizational culture is. A team climate is a bottom-up concept where an athlete or coaches, at the bottom levels can start to influence change. And in a well-performing organization that has a positive culture, it is normally a combination of the two: the team climate, which is the bottom-up concept, and the organizational culture, which is the top-down. And they meet somewhere in the middle. And obviously there's middle managers and first and second line supervisors that, whether it's, assistant coaches or like a defensive coordinator, that start, facilitating that between the top and the bottom. But it is really a two-way street to get a positive organization up and running smoothly. And so those are things to remember. And Ali really said it best, is we ultimately have to treat people like human beings, and remember that people have feelings and people have wants and goals and desires, that they don't not only want themselves to succeed, but they want the team and the organization as a whole to succeed as well. So how do we as coaches, and how do we as the organization itself, the front office staff, how do we best meet that with our own goals in mind? And ultimately, it's treating people with dignity and respect.
Awesome. Well, Ali, Bob, Jeremy, really appreciate your wise insights here. Really appreciate such a sensitive topic, such an important topic. And Jeremy, all the best with your research. And I know we've got a few more conversations to be had to see what we can do to help advance this conversation. This is certainly not the end. So really appreciate everyone joining us. Thank you very much. And send us a note. We'll send a bit of an evaluation out, because we'd love to follow up if there's any ideas and follow-up actions that you have from this presentation. So again, appreciate everyone joining us. Ali, Bob, Jeremy, thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you having us today.